President, I welcome the Vice President, the President of the Senate, to our chamber this evening. I'm here this evening to discuss the infrastructure plan that's been proposed by President Biden and the plan along with it for massive tax increases. The Biden infrastructure plan totals a massive $2.3 trillion, but only about 20% of it actually goes toward funding anything that members of either party have ever considered infrastructure. I support more infrastructure investment, as do, I believe, most, if not all, of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. The question is, what is infrastructure, and how do you pay for it? Roads and bridges, as an example, in this proposal are only about 5% of the plan. In fact, it provides more money for long-term care than it does for roads and bridges, more money for electric cars than it does for roads and bridges, more money for schools and daycare than it does for roads and bridges. Many of these non-infrastructure ideas are worthy ones, and they should be debated, and they should be considered, but not as part of a self-described infrastructure bill, in part because the funding sources should be very different. The price tag, $2.3 trillion, soon to be $2.7 trillion, we are told, and also the scope of the bill are bad enough. But what I want to talk about tonight is the equally concerning way the Biden administration plans to pay for this massive new legislation. They want to pay for the bulk of it by completely reversing the progress we've made over the past few years in making America competitive again, in making our workers competitive again. In the 2 years before COVID-19, we saw record growth in jobs and wages, in large part thanks to the pro-growth policies we put in place through the 2017 tax cuts and reforms. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office has found that 70% of the savings from the 2017 corporate tax cuts went into workers' wages. 70%, they say, went into workers' pockets. And it's one reason that leading up to the pandemic, in February, a year and a couple months ago, we had the 19th straight month of wage growth of 3% or more annually. That was great news in my home state of Ohio. We hadn't had wage growth like that in over a decade, maybe 2 decades. Most of that benefit, by the way, went to middle and lower income workers. Exactly what you want. During that time period, a couple years before the pandemic hit, we tied the 50-year low in unemployment at 3.5% and had the lowest unemployment ever for blacks and Hispanics. In fact, before the pandemic, we had reached the lowest poverty rate, 10.5%, since we started recording this data back in 1959. So the lowest poverty rate on record. Importantly, tax reform also stopped these corporate inversions. You may remember this. Companies were actually becoming foreign companies so they could get from under our tax code. This made no sense. And it was happening during the Obama administration and during the first year of the Trump administration. We also ended the so-called lockout effect, caused by a tax code that made it too expensive to bring earnings back home, foreign earnings back home, so people kept their earnings overseas. In fact, during that couple of years, $1.6 trillion in overseas earnings has now come back home to invest and create jobs here. $1.6 trillion. We want that money here. As a result of those changes, the largest U.S. companies increased domestic research and development spending by 25% to $707 billion, and capital expenditures went up by 20% to $1.4 trillion. The Biden plan would throw all that positive progress out. It would change our competitiveness to put us back where we were before, or worse. The administration's corporate tax increase raises the combined federal and state corporate rate from an average of 25.8% to 32.8%. It would put us, again, as having the highest rate in the developed world. These tax hikes, by the way, when you include the international tax hikes, are actually 5 times as large as the corresponding cuts in 2017, based on the analysis that's been done. By the way, this would also, of course, give us not just the highest tax rate among the developed countries, but also a far higher tax rate than countries like China, with whom we're trying to compete. It also changes the international tax code to make it much more costly for U.S. companies to operate outside of the United States, punishing American workers who have jobs here, supporting international sales. I use the example of Procter & Gamble in my hometown of Cincinnati. They're headquartered in Ohio, but they do business all over the world. They have told me that it'll be far more expensive for them to do that, even uncompetitive for them to be working globally, because we'll be the only developed country in the world that charges them a tax to do that. And that will hurt the jobs in Cincinnati, in Ohio, that support international sales. It just doesn't make any sense. Why would we want to go back to that and have that lockout effect where profits are kept overseas or companies actually become foreign companies? And it eliminates, in the Biden plan, the so-called foreign-derived intangible income provision. This was a carrot that we put in the law very deliberately, a carrot for companies to bring their intellectual property back here. And by the way, that's what Google did. So did Cisco. So did Qualcomm. So did Synopsys. So did Facebook. They actually brought valuable intellectual property back home, creating high-paying, high-tech jobs here in the United States of America. Why would we want to change that? The bottom line is that this tax plan that has been proposed would make us uncompetitive again in the global economy. And the Biden administration knows it. That's why when Treasury Secretary Yellen announced the proposal to increase these taxes, she actually asked other countries around the world to raise their own corporate taxes, pleading with them. We're going to raise ours. You need to now raise your taxes. Of course, when she said we need to do that to create a more level playing field, other countries in the world said, this is great. We're going to get more American investment and more business for our companies. In fact, right after she made that announcement, the finance minister in Ireland was asked a question. He said he has no interest in joining America in raising taxes, nor do others. China's not going to raise its taxes. In fact, these countries are continuing to do what they've been doing, which is knock down barriers to jobs and investment in their economy. And that makes sense from their point of view. It makes sense from our point of view to continue to be competitive also. The tax increases would mean America standing alone atop the corporate tax rate chart. Studies by the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office and others have shown that, again, it's American workers who will bear the brunt of these corporate tax hikes in the form of lost jobs and lower wages. Because of the tax hikes, the University of Pennsylvania Penn-Wharton model analyzing this Biden plan actually projects that we would see a nearly 1% decrease in GDP and a 0.7% decrease in wages by 2031 over current projections. Now, this is extraordinary to me, because that is despite the economic benefit, the obvious benefit we're going to get from this infrastructure spending. So despite all that benefit, we're still going to see a reduction in our economy, or economic growth, and a reduction in wages. This harms American workers, particularly those toward the bottom of the economic ladder. Bottom line is that the $2.1 trillion tax hike used to pay for this infrastructure bill will harm middle-class families and our businesses. And I believe the American people get that. They recognize this is not the way forward for our economy or for our infrastructure. Instead, let's follow the proven bipartisan model on infrastructure. Let's keep the plan to real infrastructure. Let's agree to what it is. Let's do it generously. Let's include broadband. Let's include water projects. Let's make it real infrastructure, though. And then let's come up with sensible pay-fors, including user fees. That's what the American people want, and that's what they deserve. I yield back my time.